Welcome to the Silent Empires, where stories move slowly through the dark, and every moment carries a quiet sense of mystery. This channel was made for the listeners who enjoy calm voices, shadowed worlds, and the feeling of getting lost in a story while the rest of the world sleeps. No interruptions, no distractions, just uninterrupted storytelling from beginning to end. If this story became part of your night, leave a like and stay a while. And before the next story begins, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? It's always fascinating to see how many people from around the world meet here together, in the silence of the night. The night is heavy with rain along the industrial fringe of Staten Island, the kind of cold drizzle that blurs streetlights into halos and turns asphalt into a dark mirror. A nondescript van sits idling near a low, windowless building ringed with neon. The sign over the door reads "Wiggles" in bright, flickering letters, promising late-night escape to anyone with cash in their pocket. But the men inside the van are not here for escape. They're federal agents wearing headphones, eyes fixed on a small bank of tape recorders that spin quietly in the dark. Every muffled word coming from inside that club, every joke, every argument, every whispered deal is being captured in real time. Inside Wiggles, a stocky, middle-aged man in an open-collared shirt moves from table to table with a careful, unhurried gait. He doesn't shout for attention. People come to him. Some greet him with a handshake, others with a nod of quiet respect. To the women who work the floor, he's the boss who signs the checks. To the regulars, he's the owner who keeps the place running. To the agents in the van, watching through weeks of surveillance, he is something else entirely. The unlikely center of what they suspect is one of the last traditional crime families operating on the East Coast. His name is Vincent Palermo, but here, among people who know his history, he is often called Vinny Ocean. The nickname sounds almost playful, the sort of thing that might belong to a friendly neighborhood businessman. Yet the files stacked on the agents' knees tell a different story. Investigations tying his club to hidden partnerships, to quiet meetings with men traced back to an organization that law enforcement has been chasing for decades. The DeCavalcante crime family of New Jersey, a group some in the press will soon call the real-life inspiration for a wildly popular television series about mob life. Outside, the city hums with the usual noise of the late 1990s, the thrum of traffic, the wail of distant sirens, the hiss of buses pulling in and out. But around this one building, the tension is almost physical. Agents know that what they are recording may help bring down men who have carefully shielded themselves behind layers of legitimate businesses, coded language, and traditions of secrecy. Inside, Palermo appears calm, almost ordinary, moving through his club with the practiced assurance of someone who sees himself as a businessman first. How, the agents wonder, did a man who looks like any other middle-aged family man in the suburbs find his way here, to the center of a long-running investigation? Tracing that path means going back half a century, to another time, another city, and a very different America. In June of 1944, when Vincent Palermo was born in Brooklyn, New York, the world was at war. American and Allied soldiers were landing on European beaches that same month. Headlines were filled with maps of battle lines and casualty reports. At home, ration books and factory shifts shaped daily life. Brooklyn was a borough pulsing with change, packed tenements, crowded streets, and a constant flow of new arrivals from other parts of the country and the world. For Italian-American families like the Palermos, the neighborhood was both a shelter and a boundary. Post-war Brooklyn's Italian enclaves offered familiarity, the language of grandparents, the smell of home cooking drifting from open windows, the predictable patterns of church bells and street festivals. Children grew up with a strong sense of us, family, neighbors, people who shared the same background and customs, who looked out for one another in sometimes hostile surroundings. At the same time, those enclaves could feel like islands, separated from the wider New York that seemed to offer opportunity but also suspicion and prejudice. In those narrow streets, boys like Vincent watched daily rituals that would leave a lasting impression. There were hardworking men who woke before dawn to drive trucks or work the docks, coming home bone-tired but proud to have kept food on the table. There were shopkeepers who knew every family by name. And then there were the other men, the ones who wore better suits, shoes that gleamed even on rainy days, men who didn't seem to punch a clock but who never appeared short of money. They were respectful to old women on the stoop, generous with tips at the local bar, and above all, they were treated with a certain careful deference. Children usually weren't told exactly who those men were, yet their presence was unmistakable. In an era when organized crime was already deeply rooted in parts of New York, the boundaries between ordinary community life and the shadow world of connected people were not always clear. You might see the same man who quietly collected debts on a side street, dropping an envelope into the collection plate at Sunday. Mass, you might hear adults lower their voices when a particular name was mentioned. Young Vincent would have grown up in a culture where loyalty was praised, where keeping family business private was a virtue, and where power could look very different from the official faces at City Hall. At the same time, post-war America was telling a different story about success. The GI Bill, the boom in suburbs, the rise of television all created an image of upward mobility. The idea that, with enough hard work and discipline, any child could grow up to secure a better life. Schools stressed this ideal, even as many working-class immigrant families struggled to see how it might realistically apply to them. In crowded neighborhoods like Vincent's, money was tight, and young people routinely left school early to help their parents, taking jobs in shops, on trucks, or in warehouses. Like many in his generation from similar backgrounds, Vincent did not step directly into the world he would later be known for. His early years appear, in many ways, unremarkable. A boy in a bustling borough, part of a large Italian-American population that was simultaneously proud of its heritage and eager for stability. Public records and later reporting depict him as an unflashy, work-oriented young man who, long before anyone linked his name to organized crime, was trying to carve out a place in the legitimate economy. As he moved into adulthood, the country around him was changing rapidly. The 1950s gave way to the turbulence of the 1960s. Civil rights marches, assassinations, protests against the war in Vietnam. New York, like other major cities, was grappling with deindustrialization, shifting demographics, and rising tension between communities and the authorities. For families focused on paying rent and keeping children safe, these global and national developments could feel very distant. Yet their effects were felt in daily life, in factory closures, in changing neighborhoods, in the sense of uncertainty about the future. For a young man with limited formal education but a willingness to work, the path to security often ran through physically demanding jobs. The waterfront, the markets, the distribution yards, all these places offered steady employment for those prepared to put in long hours. Over time, Palermo gravitated toward the kind of work that blended physical labor with an eye for trade, buying, selling, moving goods. It was in these environments, with their early mornings and cash deals, that he began to develop the skills and contacts that would later define his public image as a businessman. The seafood trade in particular became central to his story. In the mid-20th century, supplying fish to New York and New Jersey markets was still an operation rooted in long-standing relationships. Boats, wholesalers, restaurant owners, small markets, each depended on trust, reliability, and the ability to handle perishable goods efficiently. It was a world where being known as someone who delivered on time, who didn't cut corners with quality, could build a solid reputation. In that world, the nickname Vinny Ocean emerged, a casual shorthand that linked him to the products he was moving, and, in a way, to the larger maritime economy that fed the region. If the official records of Palermo's early working life are thin, The broad outlines match those of many Italian-American men of his generation who moved between New York and New Jersey in search of better prospects. New Jersey, with its mix of industrial centers, ports, and growing suburbs, offered opportunities just across the river from the crowded streets of Brooklyn. The post-war decades saw thousands of families make that move, lured by slightly larger homes, quieter neighborhoods, and the sense of a fresh start. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the New Jersey Shore region and nearby communities were drawing those who wanted to balance proximity to the city with a different pace of life. Palermo joined this flow, establishing himself as a small businessman, someone who appeared to be part of the thriving, if often precarious, network of independent operators supplying food and services to the region. Friends and neighbors would later recall him in this period less as a figure of fear than as a man focused on his trade and his family, blending into the landscape of modest aspiration that defined many suburban streets. At the same time, New Jersey had its own long history with organized crime, distinct from but intertwined with New York's. Since the early 20th century, groups of Italian-American criminals had carved out their territory in cities like Newark, Elizabeth, and Trenton. One of the most significant of these groups, which federal agencies would eventually classify as a full-fledged crime family, came to be known as the DeCavalcante Organization, named after Sam DeCavalcante, a reputed boss who would later gain notoriety in the 1960s and 70s. The DeCavalcante group was smaller than the big New York families, but it was deeply rooted in New Jersey soil. Construction, labor unions, illegal gambling, loan schemes. Its members used a mixture of fear, favors, and corruption to influence the economic life of the region. They prided themselves on being disciplined and discreet, often avoiding the theatrical violence and flamboyant displays that brought so much heat onto some of their New York counterparts. In this world, reputation was built not only on toughness, but on reliability, secrecy, and the ability to blend into legitimate business. It was into this broader context that Palermo slowly moved, not through a dramatic initiation but through the quieter, more gradual process common in such circles. Marriage ties, business partnerships, social contacts started at weddings, baptisms, and neighborhood gatherings. According to later law enforcement accounts and court records, members of his extended family and social circle had long-standing associations with figures in the New Jersey underworld. In communities where everyone seemed related to everyone else, where a cousin's husband might know a man from the union, and where favors passed back and forth as part of daily life, the line between simply knowing such people and actively working with them could become blurred. For Palermo, the seafood business and other ventures provided both cover and connection. Supplying restaurants and clubs meant dealing with a range of clients, not all of them focused solely on the legal side of profit-making. The skills required to thrive in that world, negotiation, a tolerance for risk, and a willingness to operate in cash-heavy environments, were very similar to those valued in less legal pursuits. Step by step, without fanfare, a man who had once been simply another working-class Brooklyn kid was moving into circles where the word family carried more than one meaning. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine this as a sudden break from the world he knew. The codes emphasized in the criminal subculture, loyalty, silence, and emphasis on providing for one's own, were often framed in terms not so different from the traditional values promoted in his community growing up. What distinguished one path from another was not the language of loyalty itself, but the methods used to secure status and security. In a New Jersey still struggling with crime, corruption, and economic change, Palermo's willingness to form closer ties with men rumored to be part of the DeCavalcante network set him apart from more cautious contemporaries. As the 1970s wore on, the nation grappled with economic turmoil. Oil shocks, inflation, a general sense that the easy prosperity of the 1950s and early 60s was gone. In the Northeast, factories closed or reduced shifts, and blue-collar jobs that had once seemed stable began to disappear. For men like Palermo, running their own businesses or working in trades that depended on fluctuating demand, these pressures were intense. It was in precisely such periods that organized crime often tightened its grip, exploiting vulnerability among small business owners, moving more aggressively into industries where regulation was weak and oversight lax. Palermo's reputation as a competent businessman and as someone connected, at least socially, to influential figures in New Jersey made him a valuable intermediary. From the outside, he was still seen primarily as a provider, a man whose livelihood depended on perishable goods and the rhythms of the market. He was not at this stage a notorious name in newspaper headlines or a target fixed in law enforcement sights. To neighbors and many associates, he looked like another example of the Italian-American success story, someone who had escaped the cramped tenements of post-war Brooklyn for a more comfortable, if hardly extravagant, suburban life. But beneath that surface, the foundations of his later reputation were being laid. The traditions of his youth, community solidarity, wariness of outside authority, the elevation of personal loyalty over formal rules, combined with the very specific pressures and opportunities of New Jersey's shadow economy. The seafood business, with its dependence on quick decisions and rapid movement, had trained him to think in terms of margins and timing. His marriage and social life had brought him into close proximity with people whose power did not come from elections or corporate titles, but from networks of fear and obligation. In the years to come, as older leaders were arrested or passed from the scene, that combination of traits would make him increasingly important to men who needed reliable partners to keep their operations running. And as law enforcement shifted its focus, strengthened by new surveillance tools and legal strategies, the quiet, almost anonymous figure who once moved crates of fish in the pre-dawn hours would slowly emerge as a person of interest on the files stacked in investigators' offices. For now, though in the story's early chapters, he remains in the background, a working man whose accent and habits mark him as a product of post-war Brooklyn, whose chosen trades tie him to the docks, the markets, and eventually to the late-night world of New Jersey's bars and clubs. The seeds of his future role, a mix of ambition, adaptability, and proximity to power, are in place, even if only a few people around him can see where those seeds might grow. Those seeds began to take root in the 1970s, in the small but consequential decisions that turned Vincent Palermo from a man trying to make his way in legitimate trade into someone deeply entangled with a criminal organization that had been part of New Jersey's landscape for decades. As the decade opened, the docks and wholesale markets that supplied fish to the New York, New Jersey region were still rough, cash-heavy environments. Deals were often made on trust or on fear, and disputes were not easily settled by calling the police. The seafood business gave Palermo a foothold there. He moved product, extended credit, and built a reputation among buyers who came from all walks of life, including people whose influence came from connections to organized crime. In these years, Palermo's personal life intertwined with that underworld in subtle but important ways. Reporters and law enforcement officials would later point out that he had close relatives by marriage who were already part of, or very close to, the De Cavalcante network. One name that appears repeatedly in indictments and press accounts is Frank Polizzi, a long-standing figure in the family whose relationship to Palermo was described as that of an in-law. In Italian-American communities like the one stretching from Brooklyn to central New Jersey, in-laws were not just legal relatives. They were part of a web of obligation. Weddings, baptisms, and family dinners brought ordinary people into the orbit of men who lived double lives. And young businessmen like Palermo learned early that work and kinship could not always be neatly separated. By the mid-1970s, Palermo was no longer just a man delivering seafood. He was someone who knew how to move money, to manage accounts, and to juggle the competing demands of suppliers and clients. Those abilities attracted attention. In later testimony, investigators would describe how men already established in the DeCavalcante family began to use him as a trusted contact, at first for seemingly minor tasks. A delivery made without too many questions asked, a debt collected with a firm but not flamboyant hand, a quiet introduction to someone who could fix a problem. In the world he was entering, these were not random errands. They were tests, ways to evaluate whether a man could be counted on to follow instructions and to keep silent. To understand Palermo's trajectory in this period, it is crucial to see the larger picture of organized crime in New Jersey. The DeCavalcante organization had grown from the Prohibition era into a recognized crime family by mid-century, but it was often overshadowed by the larger, more notorious New York families. Simone Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante, whose notoriety in the 1960s came in part from an FBI bug planted in his office, had given the group its name in the public imagination. After he stepped back from leadership amid legal troubles, a succession of bosses and acting bosses kept the family's operations going. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and infiltration of construction and trucking contracts. Unlike the New York families that found themselves the subject of sensational headlines and major federal commission trials in the 1980s, the DeCavalcantes prided themselves on staying out of the spotlight. Their base in Elizabeth and surrounding towns, their use of small social clubs rather than flashy restaurants, and their cultivation of local political and union connections made them appear, to many outsiders, almost like a regional footnote. But that illusion of smallness masked real power, especially in certain industries. For an ambitious but discreet man like Palermo, the family's low profile offered both opportunity and a kind of cover. At the same time, the legal landscape was changing. In 1970, the United States passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a law designed specifically to target patterns of criminal activity carried out by enterprises like the mafia. Over the next decade, prosecutors began to experiment with the new tool. By the mid-1980s, they were using it aggressively against the 5 major New York families, culminating in the famous commission trial that sent a generation of bosses and underbosses to prison. These high-profile cases had 2 important effects for someone in Palermo's position. They weakened the dominance of New York bosses in some areas, creating openings for lesser-known groups, and they pushed organizations like the DeCavalcantes to become even more cautious, relying heavily on businessmen whose legitimate fronts could make money flows harder to trace. Palermo fit that need precisely. He could plausibly present himself as a self-made businessman whose income came from hauling and selling fish, later from other ventures that branched into distribution and entertainment. He was not known for ostentatious spending. Neighbors in New Jersey suburbs where he lived would later tell reporters that he resembled a typical middle-aged homeowner. Tidy yard, family cars in the driveway, children going off to school. Nothing about that surface picture signaled the role he was assuming behind closed doors. Inside the DeCavalcante organization, however, his status was rising. Federal indictments and court documents from the 1990s, which look back on this period, refer to him as an associate during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a man closely connected to MAID members, trusted to handle money, and to participate in schemes that ranged from illegal gambling to loans made at punishing interest rates. In these ventures, harm did not take the form of headline-grabbing acts of violence so much as quiet, grinding pressure on vulnerable borrowers and the corrosion of legitimate commerce by intimidation and fraud. The profits could be good, and for someone like Palermo, who had already learned to manage risk in a volatile seafood market, the work played to his strengths. As his reliability was proven over time, the doors to deeper involvement opened further. In Cosa Nostra tradition, there is a sharp distinction between an associate, someone who works with a family but is not formally sworn in, and a made member who has undergone a secret induction and is considered part of the organization in a permanent, almost sacred way. Law enforcement sources and later witness testimony converge on the conclusion that by the late 1980s, Palermo had crossed that line. Precisely when and how the induction occurred remains the subject of quiet dispute among sources, but there is broad agreement that he emerged from that period no longer merely a helpful businessman, but a full-fledged member of the Cavalcante family. That step changed everything. As a made man, Palermo was now protected in certain ways. No one within the organization could harm him without authorization from the top leadership, but he was also bound by stricter rules of obedience and secrecy. He received his own crew of associates and junior members, people who answered to him for direction, and who brought him a share of their earnings from bookmaking, loan operations, and other rackets. The man who once rose before dawn to move fish was now also spending nights and weekends in social clubs and back rooms, counting envelopes and mediating disputes. Contemporaries inside the underworld later described him to investigators as businesslike and unemotional, more inclined to talk in terms of percentages and schedules than in the heated language often associated with street enforcers. That demeanor suited the Cavalcante leadership at the time. John the Eagle Riggi, who formally took over as boss in the early 1980s, was himself a man who balanced union office with criminal command. Riggi and his advisors needed subordinates who could understand both worlds, who could sit with a contractor one day and with hardened criminals the next, and keep both settings separate. Palermo's growing portfolio of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises made him one of those rare figures. One highly visible piece of that portfolio would later draw particular attention: his ownership of a strip club on Staten Island known as Wiggles. The precise date he became involved is difficult to pin down in public records, but by the late 1980s and into the 1990s, authorities consistently described him as the club's owner and operator. On the surface, Wiggles was just one of many adult entertainment venues dotting the fringes of New York's outer boroughs. To federal agents looking back later, it was a convenient meeting place, a cash-generating business where money could be moved, laundered, and distributed with relative ease. While Palermo's economic and social importance within the family was growing, the wider organization was entering a more turbulent phase. In 1990, Riggi was convicted in federal court for labor racketeering tied to his control of construction unions. Prosecutors demonstrated how contracts had been steered, bids rigged, and union resources exploited for private gain. Riggi was sent to prison, but like many bosses before him, he did not relinquish control entirely. From behind bars, he continued to communicate through trusted intermediaries, designating acting bosses and a kind of ruling panel to manage day-to-day affairs. This transition increased the importance of men like Palermo. With the official boss absent, the family needed strong earners who could also command respect across different factions. Indictments later identified Palermo as having risen to the rank of captain, known colloquially as a capo, by the late 1980s. As a captain, he no longer reported merely to one superior. He was part of the managerial layer of the family, responsible for supervising several crews and for contributing significantly to the organization's collective income. It was also in this period that Palermo became involved in one of the most serious crimes later charged against him, an episode that illustrates how deeply the Cavalcante family's economic interests were entangled with violence. The case centered on a man named Fred Weiss, a Staten Island real estate developer and former newspaper publisher who had invested in a waste disposal venture. By the late 1980s, illegal dumping and environmental violations in the New York region were drawing intense scrutiny from regulators and prosecutors. Weiss's operation, according to federal accounts, came under investigation, and there were fears within organized crime circles that he might cooperate with the authorities to lessen his own legal exposure. Several different crime groups had a stake in the waste business, including the powerful Gambino family in New York. According to subsequent prosecutions and testimony, Gambino boss John Gotti communicated his concern about Weiss to his counterparts in New Jersey, and the DeCavalcante leadership agreed that the risk posed by a potentially cooperating witness had to be addressed. Palermo, by then a trusted captain with operations that overlapped the waste industry and related businesses, was drawn into the planning. What happened next would be recounted in chillingly matter-of-fact tones years later, when former associates testified under oath. Fred Weiss was shot and killed outside his Staten Island home in September 1989. There were no theatrics, no public pronouncements, only a brief, lethal encounter that removed a man from the world and sent a clear message about the costs of perceived disloyalty. Prosecutors later charged that the killing had been carried out at the request of the Gambino family and implemented by DeCavalcante members and associates, among them Vincent Palermo. In the late 1990s, facing his own indictment, Palermo would acknowledge to federal authorities that he had played a central role in the conspiracy that led to Weiss's death. The act marked a decisive point in his criminal career. Up to that moment, he could be seen primarily as an economic actor within the family, someone who orchestrated and profited from schemes that, while harmful and illegal, often operated in the background of everyday life. With the Weiss case, he had become part of a decision to end a human life in order to protect a criminal enterprise. Inside the organization, this made him more trusted, not less. In the informal code of the mafia, a man who showed he was willing to follow deadly instructions without hesitation proved his loyalty in the most extreme way. Palermo's standing rose. He was seen not just as a moneymaker, but as someone who had demonstrated the hard resolve that allowed the family's threats to be taken seriously. For a time, this translated into greater influence, broader responsibilities, and, according to government evidence, a larger personal share of the profits flowing through his various ventures. Outside the organization, the long-term consequences were different. The Weiss killing attracted the attention of investigators in both New York and New Jersey. At first, they struggled to piece together who was responsible. Years would pass before the full story emerged in court. But the case was one more entry in a growing dossier of serious crimes linked to the DeCavalcante network, and Palermo's name would eventually be attached to it in bold type on a federal indictment. In the meantime, though, his public image remained that of a businessman. He continued to run his club, to invest in property and other ventures, and to present himself as a family man in the suburbs. People who interacted with him on the surface saw a man who returned home at night, who was present at school events, who seemed more like a local entrepreneur than a figure at the center of a criminal conspiracy. This duality, the respectable exterior and the hidden role in organized crime, is one of the reasons journalists and commentators would later point to the DeCavalcante story as an eerie real-life parallel to popular fictional depictions of mob bosses. By the early 1990s, the currents pulling at Palermo's life were intensifying. Inside the DeCavalcante family, the imprisonment of Riggi and the aging of older capos created a shifting balance of power. Younger, more adaptable figures who combined business acumen with a proven record of obedience began to move toward the top. Palermo was among them, a man whose quiet rise from fish wholesaler to captain had depended on his ability to navigate both the legitimate economy and the shadowed world of illegal enterprise. At the same time, law enforcement was learning from past battles with organized crime. The tools that had been used to dismantle parts of the New York families, the RICO statutes, electronic surveillance, long-term undercover operations, were being refined and directed more methodically at groups that had once operated in relative obscurity. Agents who had previously focused their attention across the Hudson were starting to look more closely at New Jersey, at labor unions, construction contracts, waste hauling routes, and at the adult entertainment venues where, according to informants, some DeCavalcante leaders liked to meet. For the moment, Palermo still appeared to move confidently between his roles, seemingly untouched by the gathering storm. His businesses functioned, his crew brought in money, and his name, while not unknown to investigators, was not yet the focus of a full-scale federal offensive. Yet, as would become clear in the decade ahead, the same qualities that had propelled him upward, his visibility as an earner, his closeness to the family's financial core, his involvement in cases like the Weiss killing, also made him an inevitable target once the investigative net tightened. The era in which a DeCavalcante captain could operate in the shadows was drawing to a close, and Vincent Palermo's life was about to be drawn into the harsh light of sustained federal scrutiny. By the early 1990s, the contradictions in Vincent Palermo's life had hardened into a stable pattern. By day, he could be seen tending to his businesses, visiting suppliers, talking with lawyers and accountants, projecting the image of a man whose concerns were payrolls and delivery schedules. By night, and often far into the small hours, he stepped into a different role entirely, captain in a criminal organization whose reach stretched from small New Jersey towns to the outer boroughs of New York City. For years, he managed to keep those worlds separated in public view. Inside the DeCavalcante family, however, the separation was an illusion. His business acumen, his willingness to obey orders, and his growing network of subordinates made him central to how the organization functioned. The imprisonment of official boss John the Eagle Riggi in 1990 had set off a long, complicated reshuffling of power. From a federal penitentiary, Riggi tried to preserve the family structure, communicating through visitors and intermediaries. According to later court testimony and investigative files, he first relied on an acting boss, John D'Amato, to oversee day-to-day matters. D'Amato's tenure was brief and turbulent. In 1992, he disappeared and was later widely reported, based heavily on insider testimony, to have been killed by his own organization after rumors about his private life reached senior figures. The case became a minor media sensation years later, when prosecutors described how personal prejudice and internal paranoia could prove deadly. Palermo's name did not surface as a direct participant in that episode, but the killing underscored the unforgiving culture in which he operated. In this world, standing at the top meant living under a constant shadow of potential betrayal. After D'Amato's disappearance, power moved again, this time to Giacomo Jake Amari, a veteran underworld figure who served as acting boss throughout much of the early and mid-1990s. Palermo, by then firmly established as a captain, was one of the men Amari relied on to keep money flowing. In law enforcement accounts, the picture that emerges from this period is of a man whose operations straddled geography and industry. In New Jersey, his crew handled illegal sports betting, card games, and loans that kept financially distressed borrowers locked into cycles of payment and fear. On Staten Island, his club, Wiggles, became a key hub, a place where cash could be washed through payrolls and bar receipts, and where quiet conversations could be held away from curious neighbors. Despite the club's neon sign and rowdy clientele, Palermo himself cultivated an image of controlled, almost bland professionalism. Employees and patrons later described him as polite and reserved, a man who rarely raised his voice on the premises. The more volatile side of criminal life, arguments over territory, discipline meted out to those who broke unwritten rules, was carried out elsewhere, in cars, diners, and small neighborhood hangouts whose back rooms served as informal offices for the family's leadership. It was in those spaces that Palermo cemented his reputation as a reliable earner, someone who understood not only how to bring in money, but how to keep trouble contained. Outside, the landscape of organized crime in America was being reshaped by forces that seemed, at first, far from the brick storefronts and social clubs of New Jersey. Federal prosecutors, buoyed by their successes against the major New York families in the 1980s, were looking more broadly. They had learned that the most effective way to attack entrenched criminal groups was not through intermittent arrests for individual acts, but through sweeping RICO indictments that treated the family itself as an ongoing criminal enterprise. That approach required a different style of investigation. Years of surveillance, undercover work, cultivation of informants willing to wear hidden microphones and record conversations they had once sworn to keep secret forever. The DeCavalcante family had initially benefited from the intense focus on New York. Smaller, more cautious, and anchored in New Jersey politics and unions rather than Manhattan nightlife, its leaders believed they could operate below the radar if they avoided the flamboyance that had doomed men like John Gotti. But by the mid-1990s, that confidence was misplaced. Agents in the Newark and New York field offices had begun to assemble a comprehensive picture of the family's hierarchy. Confidential sources provided names and roles. Court-authorized wiretaps picked up snippets of conversations about union contracts, gambling debts, and the delicate question of who would inherit power once aging bosses succumbed to prison or illness. Within that tense environment, Palermo's ascent continued. As acting boss Amari battled health problems, he would die of stomach cancer in 1997. Palermo's role expanded. He was trusted to represent the family's interests in dealings with other groups, including New York organizations that shared territory and, at times, joint ventures in construction, trucking, and waste disposal. Cooperation was always fragile in such settings. A misunderstanding over who controlled a particular gambling route or a lucrative contract could spiral into long-running disputes. Palermo's ability to speak the language of business and to keep a cool head in negotiations made him a useful intermediary. At the same time, he was becoming a focal point of internal anxiety. The very qualities that made him valuable, his growing wealth, his control over a profitable crew, his access to the imprisoned boss, also made him a potential rival for other ambitious figures. One of those rivals, according to long later indictments and testimony, was veteran capo Charles Big Ears Maggiore. Maggiore came from a family with deep roots in the DeCavalcante organization. His father had been a respected figure in earlier decades, and he saw himself as a natural candidate for higher office. Federal prosecutors would later allege that in the mid-1990s, as Amari's condition worsened and the question of succession grew more urgent, the tension between Maggiore and Palermo sharpened into open plotting. In one version, told to investigators by insiders who ultimately broke the code of silence, Maggiore approached an associate and floated the idea of eliminating Palermo to clear his own path to leadership. The associate refused and, in a move that would reverberate through the family, informed Palermo of the approach. In a single conversation, Palermo learned that a fellow captain, a man of long-standing stature, had considered having him killed. In the logic of the underworld, such knowledge could not simply be set aside. Palermo, these same accounts say, sought guidance from above. Even with Riggi behind bars and Amari gravely ill, the imprisoned boss's word carried weight. Palermo presented the situation, framing Maggiore's alleged actions as a betrayal that needed to be addressed. Permission was reportedly granted to respond in kind. What followed was a period of shadow maneuvers, as men loyal to each side watched and waited, weighing their orders against their own survival instincts. Prosecutors would later describe at least one aborted attempt on Maggiore's life linked to Palermo's camp, an attempted ambush that never materialized because the would-be attackers lost their nerve or found circumstances too uncertain. The details that emerged in court were sparse and carefully presented, but the outline was clear. The DeCavalcante organization, already under pressure from law enforcement, was now also wrestling with the possibility of internal bloodshed at its highest levels. That no murder actually occurred in this particular power struggle was less a sign of restraint than of calculation. Each side understood too well that a killing of a senior figure would inevitably attract intense investigative scrutiny. Through it all, Palermo maintained his outward composure. In public, his focus appeared to be on his businesses. Wiggles, increasingly visible on Staten Island's nightscape, was one of several ventures he used to ground his image as a legitimate entrepreneur. In New Jersey, his operations intersected with construction firms, small trucking concerns, and other industries where the line between legal and illegal profits could be deliberately blurred. When reporters would later comb through property records and business filings, they found a pattern familiar in organized crime cases. Layers of corporations, some apparently engaged in routine commerce, others sitting quietly on assets, all making it more difficult to trace the flow of money back to a single individual. Culturally, the 1990s also brought a development that no one in the DeCavalcante family could have fully anticipated: the sudden renaissance of the mafia as an object of public fascination. Not through lurid tabloid stories, but through prestige television. In January 1999, HBO premiered The Sopranos, a series about a New Jersey mob boss juggling family obligations and criminal responsibilities. The show's creator drew broadly on the region's history, though he did not base his characters directly on specific individuals. Still, the parallels were close enough that people who had spent their lives in and around the DeCavalcante orbit felt an uncomfortable familiarity when they watched. Federal agents, by then listening to bugged conversations inside one of the family's New Jersey hangouts, captured moments in which real-life mobsters discussed the program. Transcripts later made public show a mix of amusement and unease. They laughed at the accuracy of certain scenes, critiqued others as unrealistic, and worried aloud that the show might encourage more people to talk to law enforcement by making informants into complex, even sympathetic figures. These candid reactions were more than cultural commentary. To prosecutors, they were confirmation of how closely the series mirrored the lived experience of a group they were actively investigating. For Palermo himself, the overlap between fiction and reality was particularly striking. Here was a drama centered on a New Jersey boss who maintained a veneer of respectability, who met associates in strip clubs and suburban diners, who worried about being recorded by unseen government ears even as he tried to keep his own crew loyal. The television character's name, Tony Soprano, was different, but the world he occupied looked very much like the world Palermo helped rule. In press coverage that followed Palermo's eventual downfall, commentators would routinely refer to him as part of the real-life Sopranos, a shorthand that captured public imagination, even as it risked blurring important distinctions between scripted entertainment and the real harm caused by the crimes under examination. While television audiences were discovering this dramatized underworld, agents and prosecutors were putting the final pieces in place for a major strike against the actual organization. Years of work had gone into cultivating sources willing to wear hidden microphones. One of them, a DeCavalcante insider facing his own legal troubles, agreed to cooperate and began attending meetings with senior figures while recording their conversations. Those tapes captured discussions of gambling operations, union influence, past acts of violence, and, crucially, the current leadership structure. From those recordings, a clear picture emerged of Palermo's standing. With Amari dead and Riggi still incarcerated, the family had moved to a kind of committee system. According to later indictments, Riggi endorsed a three-man panel to oversee affairs in his absence. That panel included Girolamo Jimmy Palermo, no close relation to Vincent despite the shared surname, Charles Marjorie, and Vincent Vinny Ocean Palermo. In practice, however, law enforcement officials concluded that Vincent was the dominant figure, the de facto boss whose control over significant revenue streams and key personnel gave him disproportionate influence. This assessment was not based solely on hierarchy charts, but on the way decisions flowed. On tape, men discussed seeking his approval for sensitive matters. Money was counted with an eye toward what share would go upstairs for the boss and the imprisoned Riggy. While formal titles in the mafia can be fluid and contested, especially in times of transition, the pattern was clear enough for prosecutors. When they eventually filed their RICO case, they would describe Palermo as the boss of the De Cavalcante family during much of the later 1990s, responsible not only for overseeing ongoing rackets, but for maintaining discipline and resolving disputes. Balancing that responsibility with the need to avoid detection was becoming increasingly difficult. The same RICO laws that had reshaped the landscape in the 1980s were now bearing down on smaller organizations like the De Cavalcantes. Maximum sentences for racketeering conspiracies were long enough to make even hardened veterans think carefully about their prospects if arrested. The Federal Witness Protection Program, once viewed with skepticism inside criminal circles, had developed a long track record of relocating and supporting cooperators and their families. The old assurances that no one would dare testify, that the code of silence was unbreakable, sounded less convincing than they once had. Within the family, this new reality produced a mixture of defiance and worry. Some clung to tradition, insisting that loyalty would hold. Others, especially younger members who had grown up watching televised trials and reading about famous informants, were less certain. To keep order, bosses like Palermo had to reassure their subordinates that the organization remained strong, that its protection was meaningful, and that defection would be met with severe consequences. At the same time, they had to be careful not to provoke the kind of spectacular violence that would draw immediate, overwhelming attention from the authorities. By 1998, the balance Palermo had maintained for so long was nearing its limit. The FBI and federal prosecutors in New Jersey had obtained authorization for a comprehensive RICO case targeting the De Cavalcante leadership. Surveillance had yielded hours of audio and reams of transcripts. Cooperating witnesses had filled in gaps in the narrative. Investigators traced the organization's earnings from illegal gambling and loan sharking through front businesses and bank accounts, building a chain of evidence they believed could withstand the scrutiny of a jury. Unaware of the precise timing but increasingly conscious of the pressure, Palermo continued to move through his routine. He visited Wiggles, monitored his crew's earnings, and maintained contact with imprisoned superiors. In casual conversations, he and other leaders speculated about who might be talking to the government, about how much agents really knew. They weighed minor changes in routine, different meeting places, more cautious language on the phone, without necessarily grasping how thoroughly their world had already been penetrated. The arrest that would change everything for Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo was close at hand, the product of years of quiet work by men and women in government buildings who had never set foot inside his club. For decades, he had navigated the overlapping currents of family loyalty, ethnic identity, economic ambition, and criminal opportunity that defined a certain slice of post-war American life. Now, as the 1990s drew to a close, those currents were about to converge in a federal courtroom, where the choices he had made in back rooms and parking lots would be translated into counts on an indictment, each carrying the possibility of a long prison term. What neither he nor the agents preparing the case could fully anticipate was how dramatically his response to that indictment would reshape not only his own fate, but the future of the very organization he had helped lead. The knock came before dawn, the way it so often does in long-planned federal operations. In late 1999, as a gray winter light filtered over the New Jersey suburbs and Staten Island's row houses, teams of FBI agents and U.S. Marshals fanned out to execute arrest warrants that had been months in the making. One of those warrants carried the name Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo. By then, agents no longer saw him merely as a successful captain or a member of a three-man panel. In the thick stack of papers that made up the RICO indictment, he was identified as the boss of the DeCavalcante crime family, a man at the center of the organization's affairs. When the agents reached his door, there was no cinematic standoff. Palermo understood enough about the world he inhabited and about law enforcement to know resistance was pointless. He was taken into custody without incident, transported in an unmarked vehicle to a federal facility where, for the first time in his adult life, control over his daily movements passed entirely into other hands. The man who had directed crews, negotiated deals, and presided over meetings in back rooms now faced a different reality. A cell, a schedule set by guards, and the cold formality of initial court appearances. The indictment unsealed that day was the culmination of years of work. It charged Palermo and numerous co-defendants with racketeering under the RICO statute, listing a pattern of crimes that stretched back years. Illegal gambling operations that took bets on sports and cards across New Jersey and Staten Island, loans extended at punishing rates and collected with implied or explicit threats, schemes to steer construction contracts and manipulate labor unions, and most serious of all, murders and murder conspiracies carried out to enforce discipline or to silence perceived threats. Among the specific acts cited was the 1989 killing of Fred Weiss, the Staten Island businessman whose fate had tied together the interests of the DeCavalcantes and the New York-based Gambino family. For Palermo, reading, or having his attorneys read to him, the dense legal language must have been a jarring reckoning. It laid out in stark prose a version of his life that stripped away any pretense of ordinary business. Where he might once have spoken of helping out a family friend or investing in a venture, the indictment described extortion, racketeering, and conspiracy. The paper trail, supplemented by transcripts from hidden microphones and statements from insiders who had already agreed to cooperate, painted him not as a small businessman who had drifted into trouble, but as a central organizer of a prolonged criminal enterprise. He was not, at that moment, officially a cooperating witness. In the first weeks after his arrest, he did what many men in his position do. He retained counsel, pleaded not guilty, and prepared, at least outwardly, to fight the charges. In communal holding areas, news of who had been picked up and what they were charged with circulated quickly. Some DeCavalcante associates tried to sound defiant, dismissing the indictment as just another case to be beaten with sharp lawyers and cautious jurors. Others, especially those who had watched earlier RICO trials in New York result in life sentences for some of the country's most powerful mob figures, were less certain. In private conferences with his attorneys, Palermo confronted a blunt assessment. The government's case was strong. They had tapes of conversations in which he and others discussed the family's operations, complained about television shows that seemed to be borrowing from their lives, and referred to past acts of violence. They had the testimony of former insiders who were prepared to say, under oath, that he had ordered or approved serious crimes. They had financial records that tracked money from illegal ventures into seemingly legitimate businesses under his control. If convicted on all counts, he faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The calculus for a man in his position was brutal. The code he had lived under for years demanded silence. Omerta, the vow not to cooperate with law enforcement, had been extolled in countless conversations in social clubs and cars. Men who broke it were branded traitors, ostracized in absentia by the very people they once called friends or brothers. Yet the realities of the late 20th century American legal system left little room for romantic notions of going down with the ship. With long sentences and tightly run prisons, the chances of somehow continuing to influence events from behind bars were slim. At the same time, Palermo had to consider the impact on his family in the everyday sense of the word. His wife, children, and other relatives who had relied on his income and presence. A life sentence meant not only his physical absence, but the likely loss of most of his assets through forfeiture, legal fees, and restitution. The possibility of entering the Federal Witness Protection Program, with its promise of relocation and new identities for cooperators and their immediate families, offered a different, if uncertain, future. Safety in exchange for a complete break with the world he had spent decades inhabiting. Sometime after the shock of his arrest settled into routine, Palermo made the choice that would define the rest of his life. Through his attorneys, he signaled to federal prosecutors that he was willing to talk. What followed were a series of proffer sessions, closed-door meetings in which he sat with agents and assistant U.S. attorneys, and under strict ground rules, described in detail the structure and activities of the De Cavalcante family. For men raised in his subculture, these sessions were the ultimate taboo, the crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. In those rooms, the tone was clinical rather than theatrical. Prosecutors needed facts they could corroborate: names, dates, places, descriptions of meetings and decisions. Palermo, for his part, needed to demonstrate that he was both truthful and valuable. Cooperation agreements are not acts of charity. They are negotiated arrangements in which the government offers potential leniency in exchange for information that can be used to secure convictions of others. To justify a recommendation for a drastically reduced sentence, prosecutors had to be able to show that their new witness provided substantial assistance. By all available accounts, Palermo did exactly that. He walked investigators through the family's hierarchy, explaining who held which positions at various times, how orders were communicated from the imprisoned boss to acting leaders, and how money flowed upward from street-level operations to captains and, ultimately, to the top. He described the family's involvement in illegal gambling and loans, identifying specific bookmakers, collectors, and the mechanisms used to settle disputes. He recounted the circumstances surrounding the Weiss killing and other violent acts carried out in service of the organization, acknowledging his own role either as a participant or as someone who had approved the crimes in his capacity as a leader. One of the most significant aspects of his cooperation involved clarifying responsibility for internal killings that had, for years, been matters of rumor and partial information. The disappearances of figures like acting boss John D'Amato and former underboss Louis Larasso had long been understood by law enforcement to be the result of internal decisions. But without witnesses from inside the room, prosecutors had little chance of proving their suspicions in court. Palermo's debriefings, combined with information from other former De Cavalcante members who had flipped, filled crucial gaps, allowing the government to charge surviving participants or to incorporate those acts into broader racketeering narratives. The effect of his decision on the De Cavalcante family was devastating and immediate, even before his cooperation became publicly known. Word spread quickly in detention centers, and among those still on the street, that Vinny Ocean was talking. The psychological blow of seeing a man who had been regarded as boss violate the code so completely cannot be overstated. For decades, organized crime in America had presented itself as a closed world bound together by unbreakable bonds of loyalty. That myth had been eroding since the first high-level cooperators emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. But the sight of so many leading figures, in New York, in Philadelphia, now in New Jersey, choosing to inform rather than spend life in prison further undermined the old narratives. In transcripts of bugged conversations from this period, surviving De Cavalcante members vented their anger and disbelief. They spoke bitterly of betrayal, cursed the system that allowed men they viewed as killers to bargain for lighter sentences, and worried about how much of their own past conduct was now being recited in detail to attentive federal agents. The knowledge that a former boss was providing chapter and verse on the family's operations made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone else caught in the net to mount a credible defense based on ignorance or distance from decision-making. As the cases moved toward trial, the question arose of whether Palermo would take the witness stand in open court. Cooperation agreements almost always include a requirement that the witness testify if called, but prosecutors weigh carefully when and how to use such testimony. Putting a former boss on the stand exposes him to cross-examination that might reveal weaknesses or inconsistencies. It also heightens security risks and can inflame jury emotions in unpredictable ways. In the De Cavalcante prosecutions, the government had multiple cooperators, including lower-ranked members whose stories could be used to corroborate one another. Nevertheless, Palermo's stature and first-hand knowledge made him a potential star witness. When he did appear in court, the scene was striking. The man who had once held quiet meetings in Wiggles or New Jersey social clubs now sat under oath, dressed in civilian clothes but guarded by marshals, answering questions about the inner workings of an organization built on secrecy. Jurors listened as he described how debts were collected, how disputes over territory or money were resolved, and how the family reacted when it believed someone might cooperate with law enforcement. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as untrustworthy, a self-interested criminal willing to say whatever prosecutors wanted in order to save himself. They pressed him on the violence he had sanctioned, on lies he had told in the past, on the benefits he hoped to gain through his cooperation. The prosecution's strategy was to confront those issues head-on. They walked jurors through Palermo's plea agreement, which required him to admit to his own crimes and exposed him to punishment, even if mitigated. They argued that only someone who had been at the center of the conspiracy could provide the detailed, internally consistent account he was offering. They supported his testimony with independent evidence, tapes, records, corroboration from other witnesses, to show that his words were not standing alone but were part of a larger mosaic of proof. The trials that followed, which stretched into the early 2000s, resulted in a series of convictions that effectively decapitated what remained of the old De Cavalcante hierarchy. Long sentences were handed down to men who had once commanded fear and obedience in their neighborhoods. Some faced the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison. Others received terms that, given their age, amounted to de facto life sentences. In courtrooms, relatives of victims of past violence watched as the men they believed responsible were led away in handcuffs. For federal authorities, the outcome was a vindication of the RICO strategy and of the difficult, controversial decision to rely on cooperating witnesses from inside the very organizations they were trying to dismantle. When it came time for Palermo himself to be sentenced, the contrast with many of his former associates was stark. On paper, the crimes he had admitted to, racketeering, participation in murders, supervision of ongoing illegal enterprises, would have justified a life term under the federal sentencing guidelines. Left to the raw arithmetic of offense levels and criminal history, the judge's hands would have been essentially tied. But the guidelines also allowed for downward departures in cases of extraordinary cooperation. The prosecutors handling the De Cavalcante cases submitted a motion detailing the scope and impact of Palermo's assistance, arguing that, without his willingness to talk, several of the most serious convictions might not have been possible. In the courtroom, the judge confronted a moral and legal dilemma that has become familiar in organized crime cases. On the one hand, there was no doubt that Palermo bore responsibility for significant harm. He had led an organization that profited from the suffering of others, that used intimidation and, at times, deadly force to maintain its grip on illicit markets. On the other hand, his cooperation had contributed to the dismantling of that same organization and to the imprisonment of other dangerous figures. The law, as written, encouraged judges to recognize such assistance, on the theory that the long-term benefits to public safety could justify leniency for an individual wrongdoer. In the end, the court imposed a sentence far below what Palermo would have faced without his cooperation. The precise numbers are less important than the scale of the reduction. Where others of his rank and involvement received decades, he was given a term measured in years, much of it already effectively served in the time he had spent in custody awaiting the resolution of his case. To victims, families, and some observers, this outcome was difficult to accept. They saw a man who had admitted to involvement in multiple homicides and other serious crimes walk away with the possibility of living a substantial portion of his life in freedom. The federal system, however, moved forward along the lines it had long established. After sentencing, arrangements were made for Palermo and members of his immediate family to enter the Witness Security Program, commonly known as witness protection. Their names were changed. Their locations were kept secret. They were assisted in relocating to parts of the country where, in theory, no one would recognize them as former residents of New Jersey with a famous underworld surname. For the government, protecting such witnesses is not an act of generosity, but a practical necessity. If high-level cooperators were left vulnerable to retaliation from the organizations they betrayed, future witnesses would be far less likely to step forward. For Palermo, the transition must have been profound. The rhythms of his days changed completely. No more late-night meetings in clubs, no more phone calls to imprisoned bosses seeking instructions, no more calculating envelopes of cash brought in by bookies and collectors. Instead, there were new neighbors to meet under an assumed identity, new business ventures to attempt within the bounds of the law, and always the knowledge that his safety depended in part on staying out of the spotlight. The man who had once been able to walk into a Staten Island club and command instant recognition now had to navigate supermarkets and office buildings as a relative stranger. In New Jersey and New York, the echoes of his decision to cooperate lingered. The DeCavalcante family, already weakened by previous prosecutions and the changing economics of organized crime, was left in disarray. Some younger members tried to reorganize, but without the old union connections and with law enforcement now acutely aware of their methods, their reach was limited. Commentators would later argue that the era of the traditional, hierarchical mafia in the region had effectively ended not in a blaze of violence, but in a series of plea agreements signed in fluorescent-lit conference rooms. Yet the story of Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo did not end with his exit from the witness stand and his relocation under government protection. In the years that followed, the choices he made in his new life, and the ways in which his past continued to shadow him, would raise difficult questions about what it means for a former crime boss to start over, and about the broader societal trade-offs involved in offering second chances to those who had once orchestrated serious harm. For a time after his cooperation, Vincent Palermo slipped out of public view. The federal witness security program is designed precisely for that purpose, to erase the visible traces of a person's old life and replace them with something nondescript. Participants receive new names and social security numbers, are quietly moved to distant cities or small towns, and are given guidance on how to build unremarkable routines. For most, the implied bargain is clear. In exchange for detailed testimony against former associates, they must abandon not only their criminal connections, but also the identities, geographic, cultural, even emotional, that once defined them. Palermo had given investigators what they wanted. He had helped prosecutors win convictions that effectively dismantled the senior leadership of the DeCavalcante family. When he left the familiar streets of New Jersey and Staten Island under government supervision, it looked as though his story might end the way many witness protection stories do, with a life lived in quiet anonymity, punctuated occasionally by visits from U.S. Marshals checking on his status and security. But unlike many cooperators whose names never again surface in public, Palermo would, within a few years, find his way back into the headlines, this time in a very different part of the country. Press accounts and court records that emerged later revealed the outline of his reemergence. Under an assumed name, he settled in Houston, Texas, a sprawling city whose booming economy and diffuse neighborhoods made it an ideal place for someone seeking to blend in. Houston's vastness allowed newcomers to reinvent themselves without attracting immediate curiosity. For a man who had once built an undercover life inside the mafia while presenting himself as a legitimate businessman, the symmetry was striking. Now he was building an undercover life inside ordinary American society while carrying, beneath the surface, the history of a former boss. In theory, participants in witness protection are encouraged to find lawful, low-profile work, jobs that allow them to earn a living without attracting attention or reconnecting with old patterns. Palermo had other ideas. By temperament and experience, he was a businessman used to dealing in cash-heavy, high-risk ventures. Before his arrest, adult entertainment had been one of his key enterprises. In Houston, he gravitated toward familiar territory. Investigative reporting would later show that, under his new identity, he became involved in a series of clubs and related enterprises in the city's busy nightlife corridors. The adult entertainment industry in Houston shared many characteristics with the world he had known on Staten Island: long hours, late nights, a mix of patrons from different social strata, and a constant flow of cash through the door. There were also important differences. Here, Palermo operated not as a hidden arm of a traditional crime family, but as part of a loosely regulated commercial scene where the main threats were zoning disputes, moral campaigns by local activists, and the everyday financial risks of running venues that depended on discretionary spending. If there were underworld connections, they looked very different from the structured hierarchy he had once led. For several years, he succeeded in maintaining his anonymity. His neighbors and many of his employees knew him only by his assumed name. To them, he was another out-of-state transplant who had found a niche in one of the city's many service industries. Houston, with its long history of oil booms, real estate speculation, and transient populations, was used to people appearing with money to invest and then disappearing again when fortunes changed. It took a convergence of legal and journalistic attention to pierce this new layer of secrecy. The turning point came not from a criminal investigation, but from civil litigation. Running clubs in a competitive market meant dealing with landlords, lenders, suppliers, and employees. Disputes are inevitable, and in the United States, many such disputes end up in civil court. Over time, various lawsuits involving the businesses with which Palermo was associated began to generate a paper trail. There were claims involving debts and defaults, employment practices, and conflicts among partners. In the process of sorting out who owned what and who was responsible for which obligations, lawyers and judges requested detailed information about the individuals behind the companies. At some point in this process, the wall between his assumed identity and his past life cracked. Opposing attorneys, or perhaps a curious reporter, connected the dots. The man listed in Texas business filings, with a history that seemed to start abruptly at midlife, was in fact Vincent "Vinny" Ocean Palermo, former boss of the DeCavalcante family and government witness. Once that realization surfaced in public documents, the story was too striking for the media to ignore. Local newspapers and television stations in Houston, and then national outlets, ran features with variations on the same arresting premise. A one-time New Jersey crime boss, whose life had been cited as an inspiration for fictional mob tales, was now operating strip clubs in suburban Texas. The coverage drew heavily on already public records, federal indictments and sentencing memoranda from his earlier prosecutions, combined with Texas corporate filings and civil complaints. Some articles quoted bewildered neighbors, who had known their quiet acquaintance only by his assumed name and had never suspected his past. Others spoke with lawyers or employees involved in lawsuits who expressed shock, or, in some cases, a grim sense of irony, at having stumbled into a business relationship with a man whose biography sounded like something from cable television. From a legal standpoint, Palermo had not violated any law simply by going into business. Cooperation agreements and witness protection guidelines do not forbid former criminals from engaging in commerce. They require that they avoid contact with old associates, refrain from new criminal activity, and abide by the conditions set by the Marshal's Service. Adult entertainment, while controversial in some communities, is legal when properly licensed and operated within regulatory frameworks. Still, the optics of a former mob boss, who had received a dramatically reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, appearing to thrive in an industry so closely associated with his prior life, raised uncomfortable questions. Civil filings from this period suggest that not all was smooth in his Houston ventures. Lawsuits alleged unpaid debts, contentious breakups among partners, and disputes over control of businesses when revenue fell short of expectations. In at least one case, litigation followed a serious incident at one of the clubs, leading to wrongful death and negligence claims against the corporate entities connected to Palermo. While the details and outcomes of these suits varied, they painted a picture of a businessman whose post-cooperation life was far from frictionless. Financial records cited in press accounts hinted that his economic circumstances were less stable than the word boss might suggest. Despite the money he had made during his years in New Jersey's underworld and the assistance provided by the government during his transition, he faced liens, foreclosures, and the erosion of assets through judgments. In stark contrast to the image of inexhaustible mob wealth popularized in fiction, Palermo's Texas chapter showed how quickly fortunes built on risky ventures, legal or otherwise, could unravel. To scholars of criminal justice and organized crime, his case became an illustrative example in debates about cooperation and sentencing. Supporters of the government's approach pointed to the enduring impact of the DeCavalcante prosecutions. Palermo's testimony had helped remove dangerous figures from the street and had accelerated the decline of a criminal organization that had corrupted unions, preyed on borrowers, and enforced its will through intimidation and murder. From this perspective, the relative leniency shown to him was a pragmatic price paid for a larger public good. Critics, however, focused on the dissonance between his admitted past and his visible present. They asked whether someone who had ordered or approved killings should be permitted to resume a relatively comfortable life in the private sector, particularly in an industry that carried echoes of his old world. Families of victims, reading about his new businesses in Houston, sometimes expressed anger and disbelief. For them, no amount of cooperation could erase the loss they had suffered. The idea that the man partly responsible might now be drawing a paycheck, securing new properties, and for a time, enjoying his freedom seemed like a stark injustice. Within law enforcement circles, Palermo's post-cooperation life also stimulated introspection. The witness security program is designed primarily around physical safety, not moral renewal. Its administrators assess threats from potential avengers, manage relocations, and monitor basic compliance with the rules of the program. They are not tasked with guaranteeing that former criminals will live exemplary lives, nor do they typically have the resources to track every business decision or personal conflict that might lead a witness into new legal trouble. Palermo's foray into prominent, controversial businesses in a major American city, however, highlighted how difficult it can be to separate questions of safety from questions of optics. These complexities were sharpened by the cultural overlay that had surrounded his story from the moment his cooperation became public. Commentators had already drawn parallels between the DeCavalcante family and fictional depictions of New Jersey mobsters. When national outlets began running headlines linking him to Houston strip clubs, the narrative almost wrote itself. The real-life counterpart to a television mob boss, now apparently living out a quieter, but still provocative, version of that lifestyle in another state. The lines between reality and entertainment, always blurry in coverage of organized crime, blurred further. Palermo himself did not publicly embrace that framing. Unlike some former criminals who step into the media spotlight, selling memoirs or consulting on films, he granted no major interviews about his past and maintained, as much as possible, a low personal profile. In lawsuits, he appeared through attorneys. In courtrooms, when summoned to address civil matters, he was described as reserved. Whatever he felt about the portrayal of his life in fiction or in news features, he did not put his own voice at the center of those narratives. As the 2000s gave way to the 2010s, the frequency of public references to him began to decline. New scandals and new figures occupied the front pages. Organized crime itself was changing shape, with traditional families weakened by decades of prosecutions and new criminal enterprises emerging in cybercrime, transnational networks, and other arenas less tied to the neighborhood-based structures of Palermo's era. The De Cavalcante family, once a significant player in New Jersey's underworld, was now often discussed in the past tense, its remnants sometimes cited more as historical curiosities than as a present danger. For those who followed his case closely, however, the Houston years left a lasting impression. They complicated any simple narrative of redemption or punishment. Palermo had, undeniably, played a critical role in dismantling a violent criminal organization. He had also, undeniably, built his earlier life and much of his original wealth through that organization's exploitation of others. In Texas, he neither withdrew into quiet obscurity nor returned to a clearly illegal enterprise. Instead, he occupied an ambiguous middle space, a lawful businessman in a controversial field, whose past could neither be legally held against him in perpetuity nor ethically erased. By the time public reporting on him grew sparse, the sense was that he had receded once more into relative obscurity, this time more by choice than by government design. Court records became less frequent, property filing slowed. His name, real or assumed, appeared less often in searchable databases. Whether this reflected a deliberate move to step back from the spotlight after his unexpected return to notoriety, a simple aging out of the capacity for high-stress business, or a combination of both, outsiders could only speculate. What remained, for historians and analysts of organized crime, was the record, transcripts of his testimony, the indictments his cooperation helped secure, the judgments from his civil cases in Texas, and the layered media coverage that followed each phase of his life. Together, these sources offered a rare longitudinal view of one individual's passage through the overlapping systems of criminal enterprise, federal prosecution, witness protection, and post-cooperation existence. They also set the stage for a broader examination of how figures like Vinny Ocean, Palermo have shaped, and been shaped by, America's long struggle with organized crime, an examination that reaches beyond any single individual to the systems and cultures that made their careers possible. By the time Vincent Palermo's name faded from daily news reports, the world that had made him possible was itself undergoing a profound transformation. The old model of American organized crime, the tight-knit, ethnically based families that had risen with prohibition and matured in the post-war decades, was being hollowed out by a combination of aggressive prosecution, economic change, and cultural exposure. Palermo's path from Brooklyn childhood to New Jersey crime boss, then to federal witness and Texas businessman, became a kind of thread through that larger story, a concrete example used by journalists and scholars to explain how a once formidable system had unraveled. In law enforcement circles, the De Cavalcante cases were treated as a textbook demonstration of how RICO and witness cooperation could dismantle a criminal enterprise. Internal training materials and conference presentations pointed to the progression: long-term surveillance, careful cultivation of informants, patient assembly of financial records, and finally, the decision of a central figure like Palermo to switch sides rather than face the full force of the sentencing guidelines. Agents who had spent their careers on mob squads could see in his cooperation both the culmination of decades of evolving strategy and a sign that the classic mafia's ability to command absolute loyalty was gone. The statistics backed up that impression. By the early 2000s, traditional Italian-American families across the Northeast had seen their numbers dwindle. Membership estimates that had once run into the hundreds for each major family were revised downward. Union locals that had been virtual fiefdoms in the 1960s were now under reform leadership or federal monitors. Construction and waste hauling, long dominated by corrupt bidding and hidden partnerships, were subject to tighter oversight. The De Cavalcantes, never the largest of the families, were hit particularly hard. With their leadership imprisoned and their internal workings exposed in court, their capacity to shape the economic life of New Jersey diminished sharply. Palermo's role in that process was not forgotten within law enforcement. Prosecutors who had worked the case acknowledged, sometimes uneasily, that without his decision to cooperate, much of what they had alleged about the family's internal dynamics would have remained difficult to prove to a jury. Agents who had once trailed him covertly through Staten Island streets now saw his name in the footnotes of appellate decisions and in law review articles analyzing RICO jurisprudence. The same file that had once guided surveillance teams became a source for academic debates about proportional punishment and the ethics of relying on criminal insiders. Those debates were not merely abstract. In classrooms and legal symposia, Palermo's case was often presented in the form of a dilemma. A man who had ordered or approved serious crimes, including murder, escaping a life sentence because he chose to help destroy the very system he had served. Did this represent a cynical manipulation of justice or a necessary compromise to protect the public from a larger threat? Students reading excerpts from his plea agreement and sentencing transcripts wrestled with the competing imperatives: retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation that underlie criminal law. For some, the idea that the boss walked was intolerable. For others, the concrete results of his cooperation made it easier to accept a reduced sentence as an investment in future safety. Outside courtrooms and lecture halls, Palermo's story continued to intersect with the broader culture's fascination with organized crime. The overlap between his life and the fictional universe of The Soprano was irresistible to headline writers. Articles profiling the De Cavalcante family routinely juxtaposed the show's plotlines with real events: the strip club as informal headquarters, the North Jersey landscapes, the tension between suburban domesticity and violent enterprise. But it was the discovery of recordings in which actual De Cavalcante members discussed the HBO series that solidified the connection in the public mind. On those tapes, made in the late 1990s in a bugged New Jersey social club, men who had sworn secrecy critiqued the television show with the casualness of fans watching a favorite drama. They praised its realism in some respects, mocked its exaggerations in others, and worried that its portrayal of therapy and internal conflict might encourage more people in their world to talk. The transcripts, made public in subsequent prosecutions, were widely reported. Commentators seized on them as evidence that the once feared mafia had been reduced, at least in part, to an audience for its own fictionalized reflection. Palermo's name appeared in that coverage as one of the figures whose real life seemed to mirror the show's central character. Like the fictional Tony Soprano, he was a New Jersey-based boss who balanced a family life in the suburbs with leadership of a criminal crew, who met associates in a strip club and fretted about government surveillance. The comparison was never exact. The writers had drawn from a composite of histories and characters, but the broad contours matched closely enough that it became common, in magazine features and television documentaries, to refer to him as an inspiration, direct or indirect, for the series. This pop cultural framing had ambiguous consequences. On the one hand, It made the details of his case more accessible to a public that might otherwise have seen another mob trial as just one more crime story. On the other hand, it risked turning genuine suffering and coercion into the backdrop for a narrative about flawed antiheroes. Families of victims saw their personal tragedies folded into what some outlets treated as colorful lore. For them, the invocation of primetime dramas and clever dialogue did little to convey the fear and loss they had experienced when loved ones vanished or turned up dead, in circumstances later linked to Palermo's organization. Journalists who approached the story with greater care tried to keep that tension in view. Long-form pieces about the real Sopranos often made a point of interweaving scenes from neighborhood life, bread deliveries, Sunday church services, little league games, with stark reminders of what lay behind the facade. Small business owners pressured into paying for protection, borrowers trapped by compound interest and veiled threats, union workers whose pensions and safety standards were undermined by corrupt leaders accepting payoffs. Palermo's operations, while lucrative for those at the top, depended on these daily imbalances of power. To focus only on his suburban home or club ownership, these reporters argued, would be to miss the structural damage wrought by his type of enterprise. His move to Houston added an unexpected twist to this evolving narrative. When national outlets disclosed that he had resurfaced there under a new identity, running strip clubs and related businesses, commentators rushed to interpret the development. Some portrayed it as proof that he was incorrigible, unable to leave behind the environments in which he had once thrived. Others suggested it showed the durability of certain entrepreneurial skills, transposed from a criminal infrastructure to a more regulated, if morally contested, marketplace. Either way, the story reinforced a familiar media trope: the mobster who cannot quite retire, who, even when forced to abandon his old neighborhood and name, gravitates back toward the same kind of nocturnal, cash-heavy terrain. In Houston itself, reactions varied. Local officials, when asked, emphasized that whatever Palermo had done in New Jersey, his enterprises in Texas would be judged by their compliance with local law. Police and regulators focused on licensing, zoning, and routine inspections. Civil litigants, by contrast, treated his past as relevant to the question of trust and responsibility. In lawsuits over debts, injuries, and alleged mismanagement, attorneys periodically invoked his history as a way of questioning his credibility or character. Judges, bound to apply the law rather than moral impressions, generally confined themselves to the issues at hand. Contracts signed, safety protocols followed or ignored, obligations met or breached. The Federal Marshal's Service, for its part, found itself navigating a situation that fell somewhat outside its usual script. The witness security program's main task is to keep cooperators alive, not to manage their business choices. It is not a probation office. Once a witness's cooperation obligations are fulfilled and their immediate cases concluded, day-to-day monitoring typically recedes. Palermo's decision to operate high-profile venues in a major city, however, created a visibility that ran counter to the program's preference for low-key employment and unobtrusive lifestyles. While specific internal deliberations remain confidential, former officials speaking generally about such cases have acknowledged the tension. A witness's legal right to pursue livelihood versus the government's interest in avoiding exactly the kind of publicity that might compromise security. As the years passed and Palermo aged, that publicity slowly ebbed. Newer scandals in politics and finance and technology captured national attention. Within organized crime reporting, focus shifted toward emerging transnational networks and cyber-enabled schemes. In academic literature, his name migrated from current events pieces to historical analysis, appearing in chapters with titles like The Decline of the American Mafia or RICO and the Transformation of Organized Crime Control. There, stripped of the immediacy of breaking news, his life was dissected as a case study. Criminologists examined the social conditions that had shaped him. The post-war Brooklyn neighborhoods where reverence for family coexisted with tolerance for connected men. The economic pressures that made gray market opportunities attractive. The cultural narratives of masculinity and loyalty that glorified toughness and risk-taking, while stigmatizing cooperation with authorities. Legal scholars focused on the mechanics of his plea and sentencing, using his case to illustrate how substantial assistance motions could slash decades off potential prison terms. Ethicists debated whether such disparities were a necessary evil or an affront to ideals of equality before the law. Some writers placed particular emphasis on his transformation from enforcer of silence to beneficiary of disclosure. For years, Palermo had relied on his subordinates, adherents to omerta. Men who contemplated talking to the government knew that discovery could mean ostracism, retaliation, or worse. When he chose to cooperate, he reversed the logic he had once upheld. In doing so, he joined a broader pattern of high-ranking mob figures who, under pressure of long sentences and changing norms, turned to the state they had previously defied. This shift, scholars argued, revealed something essential about the limits of fear-based systems. When the protective value of belonging erodes, and when alternatives like witness protection offer a credible path to survival, even the most entrenched insiders may decide that loyalty has become too costly. For residents of the communities where he had once wielded influence, the legacy of his tenure was more tangible than any academic debate. In parts of New Jersey, the effects of DeCavalcante control over unions and contracts lingered in aging infrastructure, in stories of long-delayed repairs and sweetheart deals. Older workers remembered being told which companies they could and could not choose as subcontractors, or seeing colleagues punished for resisting imposed terms. Small business owners recounted decades later how guys from Elizabeth would appear to insist on using certain suppliers, or to discourage them from cutting prices in ways that would disturb a racket's carefully calibrated balance. When those owners and workers read, years afterward, that Palermo had been living under another name in Texas, they sometimes expressed a weary skepticism about the promise of full closure. Yes, the old crews were broken up. Yes, the most feared names were now old men or dead. But the economic pain and missed opportunities of the years when their neighborhoods were under unofficial occupation could not be undone. For them, seeing a key architect of that system enjoy relative freedom, even under the constraints of witness protection and civil litigation, underscored the asymmetry between the time frame of criminal careers and the enduring impact on those who live under their shadow. Yet even in these communities, memories grew more complicated as time passed. Younger residents who had come of age after the big trials learned about the DeCavalcantes as much through documentaries and dramatizations as through family stories. For them, Vinny Ocean was as likely to be a character in a streaming series as a name in an old newspaper. Schools, historical societies, and civic groups grappled with how to teach this aspect of local history. How to convey both the allure that organized crime had held for some and the real harm it had inflicted. Palermo's trajectory, from a boy in Brooklyn to a hidden witness in Texas, offered a narrative arc that could be used to anchor those discussions, a human thread connecting abstract terms like racketeering with concrete choices and consequences. In national memory, however, his figure gradually blurred into a wider collage of mob stories. The American imagination had, by the early 21st century, absorbed so many images of gangsters, real and fictional, that individual biographies tended to merge. Palermo's particular combination of roles, fisherman turned boss, strip club owner turned cooperator turned Houston businessman, remained distinctive. But it was now one story among many that illustrated the same themes: the seductions of fast money and local power, the corrosive effect of fear and patronage on civic life, the uneasy bargain struck by a justice system determined to break closed circles of crime. If there was a single through line in how his life was retold, It lay in the tension between ordinariness and notoriety. Neighbors in New Jersey had remembered him as a quiet man who kept his yard tidy. Patrons in Staten Island saw a club owner who chatted easily and rarely caused scenes. Employees in Houston encountered a middle-aged manager dealing with licensing agencies and staff rosters. Overlaying those mundane roles, reporters and prosecutors insisted, was a record of choices that had left a trail of damaged lives and corrupted institutions. The two perspectives were not mutually exclusive. They simply occupied different layers of the same person's experience. As he moved deeper into old age, those layers settled into a kind of uneasy equilibrium. The man who had once been identified in indictments as the boss now appeared, when mentioned at all, as a figure from the past. Former crime leader, one-time mafia boss turned informant, retired under witness protection. His physical world likely shrank to the familiar circuits common to many older Americans: doctors' offices, grocery stores, family gatherings, far removed in tempo and atmosphere from the frenetic nights at Wiggles or the tense meetings in New Jersey social clubs. From the standpoint of historical narrative, that quieting of the story poses its own challenge. Dramatic arcs invite clear resolutions: downfall, redemption, punishment, or escape. Palermo's life resists any simple label. He was, by turns, a working-class striver, a crime boss, a government witness, an entrepreneur, a defendant in civil suits, and finally, an aging man living under an assumed name. At each phase, his actions carried different implications for those around him. For some, he was a protector or provider. For others, an oppressor or a threat. For the federal government, he was first a target, then an asset, then a logistical responsibility. What endures, in the archive of court documents, news clippings, and interview transcripts, is less a moral fable than a composite portrait of an era. Through the specifics of his biography, we glimpse the textures of post-war Brooklyn street life, the intricate machinery of New Jersey rackets, the austere procedures of federal courtrooms, and the sprawling anonymity of contemporary American cities where a person with sufficient caution can, at least for a while, become someone else. It is within that wider frame that the final chapters of his story, and the questions they pose about memory, accountability, and change, come into focus. As the years after his relocation unfolded, the outlines of Vincent Palermo's life grew softer at the edges. The period of acute drama, pre-dawn arrests, racketeering indictments, tense debriefings with federal agents, testimony under oath, slid further into the past. What remained was a man carrying, in the privacy of his own mind, two biographies: the public record of a one-time mafia boss turned cooperating witness, and the day-to-day existence of an older American trying to navigate relative anonymity in a country that had once known his name. In his former neighborhoods, the memory of his presence persisted unevenly. On Staten Island, those who had frequented Wiggles in its heyday could still picture him moving through the club with quiet assurance, checking on staff, greeting certain customers with a familiarity that hinted at deeper relationships. In parts of New Jersey, where the DeCavalcante family had long operated, older residents remembered him less as a visible figure than as a name invoked in hushed tones when people spoke about who, really, controlled certain corners of construction or gambling. For younger generations, he was largely a second-hand figure, introduced through documentaries, podcasts, and true crime books that treated his story as one thread in the larger tapestry of American organized crime. Those retellings often placed him alongside other prominent insiders who had broken their oaths. In lists of major mafia cooperators, his name appeared after those of men like Joe Valachi, whose 1963 testimony had first brought the word Cosa Nostra into public parlance; Tommaso Bassetta, whose cooperation in Italy had exposed the Sicilian mafia's internal wars; and Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the Gambino underboss whose decision to testify against John Gotti in the early 1990s had electrified the American press. Palermo's case was different in scale. His family was smaller than the New York Giants, but the basic pattern was the same. A high-ranking insider, facing the prospect of decades in prison, opting to exchange information for leniency and protection. In legal and criminological discussions, his story became a particularly useful illustration of how deeply the cooperation model had penetrated the highest levels of traditional organized crime. For decades, the mafia's power had rested on an assumption that serious members would never testify against one another. Fear of retaliation was real, but just as important was the internal code, reinforced at initiation ceremonies and in countless informal lectures in club back rooms. Law enforcement was the enemy. Problems were to be handled in the family. Palermo had lived by that code for years, relying on it to keep his own orders concealed. His eventual decision to abandon it highlighted, more starkly than any abstract analysis could, how that code had been weakened by changes in the American justice system and in the broader culture. Those changes were not limited to sentencing law or the mechanics of witness protection. By the time he chose to cooperate, the mafia no longer occupied the semi-mythical position it had held in mid-century America. Congressional hearings, undercover books, and films like The Godfather had already exposed its structures and rituals. Later, the saturation of mob stories in television dramas and nonfiction alike had turned what was once mysterious into something familiar, even cliché. Palermo came of age in an era when joining a crime family still carried an aura of secrecy and illicit prestige. He entered his 60s in an era when late-night comedians joked about mob stereotypes and viewers debated online whether fictional bosses were relatable. That evolution did not directly cause his cooperation, but it formed part of the environment in which his calculation changed. The idea of the mafia as a noble, unbreakable brotherhood was harder to sustain when its inner workings had been so thoroughly documented and dramatized. In that sense, the very cultural exposure that once tempted some young men toward the life, glamorized images of sharp suits, deference, and rule-breaking, also helped strip away its ideological armor. By the 1990s, anyone paying attention could see that mob bosses ended up on the front page in handcuffs as often as they appeared in neighborhood parades. Palermo had watched the commission trial send New York's top bosses to prison. He had seen John Gotti, who once basked in media adulation, die in a federal facility after his own underboss testified against him. When his time came to choose between silence and cooperation, he did so with the knowledge that the odds of outlasting the government in a long war of attrition were vanishingly small. The communities he left behind, however, experienced the consequences of his rise and fall in much more concrete terms. On Staten Island, the closure of Wiggles under new ownership and regulatory changes signaled the end of an era in the local nightlife economy. Some former employees moved on to other venues. Others left the industry altogether. In parts of New Jersey, where the DeCavalcantes had once fixed bids and steered contracts, union locals underwent reforms, sometimes under court supervision. For younger workers who entered those trades after Palermo's era, rules about transparency and fair competition were simply part of the job. They did not always know how hard-fought those changes had been, or how deeply previous generations had felt the pressure of guys from Elizabeth showing up at job sites. Meanwhile, in Houston, where his assumed identity had briefly become a minor media sensation, the clubs with which he was associated went through the churn typical of that industry. Some changed names or ownership, others closed under the weight of financial strain, lawsuits, or shifting neighborhood politics. Patrons moved on to new establishments. Employees cycled through as they do in service economies. Only occasional legal filings and archived articles preserved the peculiar fact that, for a time, the proprietor dealing with liquor licenses and advertising budgets had once sat at the apex of a New Jersey crime family. For Palermo himself, Advancing age likely imposed a natural slowing down. Men who hold power in their 30s, 40s, and 50s often find that the intensity of those years is unsustainable as health concerns mount and social circles contract. Whatever businesses he continued to be involved in, the chances that he would again occupy a position of influence comparable to his de Cavalcante reign were effectively nil. The federal convictions he had helped secure against his former associates ensured that, even if any residual faction of the family had harbored resentment or fantasies of revenge, its capacity to act was diminished. The most dangerous men he had once commanded or competed with were either locked away or deceased. Yet the moral questions his life raised did not fade with his personal diminished prominence. In discussions about criminal justice policy, his case remained a touchstone. Advocates of robust cooperation incentives pointed to the dismantling of the de Cavalcante family as a clear public benefit. Fewer extortions, less infiltration of unions, reduced violence. They argued that this reduction in harm justified the uneasy fact that someone like Palermo would never face the maximum punishment his crimes alone might have warranted. Without insiders willing to describe who gave which orders and who profited, they contended complex criminal organizations could not be decisively broken. Skeptics countered that the system risked undermining its own legitimacy when it appeared to reward the worst offenders more than those lower on the ladder. A bookmaker or minor collector who lacked valuable information might end up serving a stiff sentence, while a boss who had ordered that underlings' actions could walk much sooner by testifying. Palermo embodied that dynamic. Some legal commentators worried that such disparities could erode respect for the law in the very communities most affected by organized crime, fostering the belief that justice was negotiable for those with the right leverage. These debates were not merely academic. They informed legislative proposals to adjust sentencing guidelines, to refine the standards for granting downward departures, and to regulate more clearly the obligations of cooperators after their release. Palermo's post-cooperation ventures in Houston, lawful but controversial, and at times litigious, served as fodder for arguments that witness protection should perhaps include stricter expectations about public prominence, even if not formal legal restrictions. Others replied that once a person had served the term imposed by a court, they should be judged by their compliance with current law, not endlessly punished for a past that the justice system had already addressed. In the background of all this, the mythology of the mafia continued its slow drift from lived reality to cultural memory. Tour operators in New York and New Jersey offered mob history walks, pointing out former social clubs and restaurants where figures like those in Palermo's world had once met. Television revisited the theme again and again, updating the aesthetics but returning to the same core tensions: loyalty versus self-preservation, family ties versus criminal demands, the allure of power versus its corrosive cost. In some of these portrayals, characters loosely inspired by the de Cavalcantes appeared under new names, their stories compressed or embellished for dramatic effect. Aside from the occasional documentary that used archival footage of courtrooms and mug shots, Palermo himself remained largely absent from these dramatizations. Unlike a few former mobsters who stepped into roles as consultants, authors, or on-camera personalities, he did not parlay his past into a media persona. That absence preserved a certain opacity about his internal life. We have the record of what he did and what he told investigators. We do not have, in his own words, a sustained account of how he understood those choices in retrospect. Did he view his cooperation as an overdue reckoning, an act of survival, or some mix of both? Did he feel remorse for specific acts, or only for getting caught in a system he had long tried to outmaneuver? Absent memoirs or extended interviews, historians can outline plausible interpretations, but they cannot speak definitively to his conscience. What can be said with confidence is that his career traced, in compressed form, the broader arc of Italian-American organized crime in the late 20th century. He entered the life as its power was beginning to erode under federal pressure, rose quickly in a smaller, regional family that had room for someone with his business skills, and then saw the structures he relied upon collapse under the combined weight of aggressive prosecution and internal betrayal. When he chose to cooperate, he did so at a moment when doing so no longer carried the same social stigma within the underworld that it had once borne. Other high-ranking figures had already broken the ice. Programs existed to relocate him. Juries were accustomed to hearing from mob insiders. In that sense, he was both a beneficiary of and a contributor to a trend that reshaped the landscape. Seen through that lens, his move to Houston and his later business ventures were less an aberration than a continuation of that theme of adaptation. Stripped of his old identity and power base, he sought to reassert control over his circumstances in the way he knew best, by organizing enterprises, managing staff, and navigating regulatory gray areas. Setting had changed, and the dangers were of a different order, but the underlying impulse, to secure economic independence in a context where rules felt pliable, remained familiar. The very skills that had made him valuable to the De Cavalcantes, his comfort with cash economies, his understanding of how to make nightlife profitable, his ability to move between front-stage respectability and backstage maneuvering, were the ones he deployed again in Texas, albeit within a legal framework. In the end, the figure that emerges from the historical record is neither a monstrous caricature nor a tragic anti-hero, but a recognizably human amalgam of ambition, adaptability, and moral compromise. As a boy in Brooklyn, he absorbed lessons about loyalty and toughness in neighborhoods where organized crime was woven into the social fabric. As a young man in New Jersey, he found that those lessons translated into opportunities for rapid advancement within a system that rewarded risk-taking and discretion. As a middle-aged boss, he made decisions that protected his organization at the expense of others' safety and autonomy. Confronted with the collapse of that system, and the prospect of spending his final decades behind bars, he recalculated and chose to assist the very forces he had once opposed. For the victims of the crimes he helped orchestrate, these nuances may offer little comfort. Their losses are not mitigated by the elegance of academic analyses or the narrative satisfaction of seeing a once powerful man later live in constrained circumstances under an assumed name. Yet for society as a whole, studying his life in detail serves a different purpose. It illuminates how organized crime embeds itself in communities, how legal frameworks can either entrench or disrupt it, and how individuals move along the spectrum from bystander to participant to leader to informant. In tracing those movements, we gain not only a clearer picture of one man's path, but also a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped an entire era of American criminal history. As Palermo's story edges toward its final pages, what remains most instructive is precisely this interplay between the personal and the structural. His choices were his own, but they were made within constraints and incentives created by neighborhoods, industries, law enforcement strategies, and cultural narratives. To grasp the full significance of his rise and fall is to see how those layers interacted over decades, and how, in the end, they produced an outcome few would have predicted when a boy named Vincent was growing up in the crowded streets of post-war Brooklyn. In the end, the man at the center of this story recedes, as so many figures in the underworld eventually do, into a kind of managed obscurity. Vincent "Vinny" Ocean Palermo, born in wartime Brooklyn, raised in crowded tenements and parish schools, climbed to the top of a New Jersey crime family, then stepped into a federal witness room and began methodically to dismantle it from within. After Houston, after the lawsuits and the headlines revealing his new identity, the public trail thins. There are fewer filings, fewer mentions in the press. His name lingers in archives and streaming documentaries, but not in the ordinary pulse of daily news. For a man whose life once depended on attention, on people knowing who he was, or at least intuiting that they should be careful in his presence. That slow fatting is its own kind of conclusion. Part of that is by design. The federal witness security program was built on confidentiality. Its administrators do not, as a rule, confirm the locations or new names of former cooperators. They move people, settle them, and then step back, intervening mainly when a threat is detected or a condition of the program is breached. If Palermo remained within that system, the lack of public information about his later years is not an accident but a feature. It is meant to give him, and by extension his immediate family, the chance to live without constantly looking over their shoulders for the ghosts of New Jersey past. But if the details of his current life are obscured, the record of what he did before that point is indelible. It sits in court transcripts where his words, under oath, spell out the internal grammar of a criminal organization. How tribute is collected, how disputes are escalated, how decisions about life and death are rationalized. It sits in sentencing memoranda where prosecutors, in carefully neutral language, balance lists of his admitted crimes against lists of convictions made possible by his cooperation. It sits in the grainy photographs that accompany old news articles. A younger man being led out of a courthouse in shackles, a more thick-set middle-aged figure emerging from a Texas office building under a different name, a still image of a former State Island Club sign flickering in the night. For historians and investigators piecing together the long arc of American organized crime, these traces are invaluable. They allow us to map how a particular kind of criminal enterprise embedded itself in everyday life, not as an alien invasion, but as a parasitic growth on existing structures of commerce and community. In the documents surrounding Palermo's rise, we see the porous borders between legitimate business and illicit opportunity. A fish wholesaler who becomes a conduit for loan sharking collections. A strip club that functions both as entertainment venue and as a discreet conference room. Union officials who sit at a table with both state regulators and men quietly representing a boss in Elizabeth. When we turn the lens outward from his biography, these specifics illuminate broader patterns. They show how organized crime in the post-war era thrived in the gaps between systems, in industries where regulatory oversight was weak, in neighborhoods where language and cultural barriers made outside authorities seem distant, in labor markets where blue-collar workers depended on intermediaries to secure jobs and contracts. Palermo did not invent those opportunities, he exploited them. When law enforcement eventually closed in, it did so not simply by arresting individuals, but by tightening the systems, strengthening union oversight, formalizing bidding procedures, expanding financial disclosure requirements that had once allowed such figures to operate in the shadows. Equally enduring, though more difficult to quantify, are the traces of harm left in the lives of those who crossed paths with his organization. The public narrative tends to focus on the most dramatic cases, the high-profile killings, like that of Fred Weiss, that carried obvious danger to witnesses and drew sharp lines in the sand of loyalty. Yet much of the damage inflicted by the DeCavalcante family under Palermo's leadership was incremental and dispersed. Small business owners coerced into paying for protection saw their profit margins shrink and their sense of autonomy erode. Borrowers who turned, out of desperation, to loan sources connected to his crews found themselves locked into cycles of repayment where interest rates were adjusted not by market forces, but by veiled threats. Workers in unions under his influence discovered that the contracts negotiated on their behalf sometimes served two masters. On paper, the rank and file. In practice, the men who collected off-the-books payments from contractors grateful for labor peace. These harms seldom made headlines, yet they accumulated over years, affecting home purchases, health care decisions, and the ability to save for retirement. When prosecutors touted the breakup of the DeCavalcante hierarchy as a victory for ordinary New Jerseyans, they had in mind not just the removal of a handful of dangerous individuals, but the long-term relief from this less spectacular, more chronic pressure. In that context, Palermo's cooperation can be seen as both an admission and a pivot. By recounting, in clinical detail, how money moved and decisions were made, he acknowledged the reality of the system he had once defended with silence. At the same time, he turned that knowledge into a tool for the very institutions he had spent decades trying to evade. The legal record does not treat this as redemption in a moral sense. It treats it as substantial assistance in a bureaucratic sense. It is a reminder that criminal justice in complex cases often operates on a calculus of trade-offs. To dismantle a structure that harms many, the state may enter into uneasy bargains with those who helped build it. For viewers of this story, that bargain can be hard to sit with. There is a dissonance in hearing, in one breath, about Palermo's role in authorizing deadly violence, and in the next, about his reduced sentence and protected relocation. That dissonance is part of the point. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that systems of harm are rarely brought down by clean moral victories. They are dismantled through negotiations with compromised actors, through incremental legal strategies, through the work of agents and prosecutors who must balance what is ideal against what is possible. At the same time, Palermo's trajectory underscores the limits of those bargains. Cooperation did not erase his past. It did not restore lives lost or years spent in fear. It did not return diverted pension funds or make up for businesses shuttered under pressure. What it did do was help close a chapter on a particular form of organized crime in a particular region, shrinking the space in which similar patterns could flourish in the future. As new forms of illicit enterprise have emerged, cybercrime, synthetic drug networks, transnational fraud schemes, law enforcement has, in turn, adapted its tools, often applying lessons learned in cases like his. Follow the money, cultivate insiders, use conspiracy laws to capture the enterprise as a whole. In popular culture, the echoes of his life continue in more diffuse ways. A new generation of crime dramas has moved beyond the Italian-American mafia to explore cartels, biker gangs, white-collar conspiracies. Still, the template refined in stories about men like Palermo remains recognizable. The double life, the tension between domestic scenes and violent decisions, the climax in a courtroom or interrogation room where silence finally cracks. When a writer sets a scene in a strip club that doubles as a headquarters, or shows a character weighing the choice between loyalty and cooperation, they are drawing, consciously or not, on a narrative vocabulary shaped in part by the real histories of families like the de Cavalcantes. For communities that served as backdrops to his rise and fall, the challenge is to move beyond that narrow lens. In Elizabeth and other New Jersey towns, efforts to reclaim local identity have emphasized stories of labor organizing untainted by corruption, of immigrant entrepreneurship that did not rely on illicit alliances, of cultural vibrancy that existed alongside, and often in spite of, the shadow of organized crime. In Brooklyn, the blocks where Palermo spent his early years have changed dramatically, shaped by waves of new immigration and gentrification. Young families pushing strollers down those streets today may have no idea that they are walking through the childhood landscape of a future mob boss. They are, instead, living out their own struggles with housing costs, school quality, and community cohesion. In Houston, the spaces once occupied by clubs linked to his assumed identity have likely been repurposed or replaced. City skylines are restless. Nightlife districts migrate as neighborhoods change. If anything of his tenure there remains visible, it is probably nothing more than a line in an old business registry or a faded sign in a storage yard. That ephemerality is a useful counterpoint to the idea that figures like Palermo are permanent fixtures. For all the noise they make during their ascendancy, their physical imprint on a city can prove surprisingly light once they are gone. What persists more reliably are the records and the stories. Archivists preserve case files, journalists' work is digitized. Oral histories capture the memories of those who lived through the years when guys from the family were simply part of the landscape. In time, students and citizens encounter these materials not as urgent warnings but as historical evidence. They ask not, how do we put these men away, but how did this happen, and what does it say about us that it did? Palermo's life, with its intersections of family, business, crime, and law, offers a particularly rich case study for such questions. It reminds us that organized crime does not arise in a vacuum. It feeds on unmet needs, access to credit, job security, dispute resolution, that mainstream institutions have failed to meet fairly or convincingly. It exploits prejudices and barriers, stepping in where certain groups feel excluded from legitimate power. It cloaks itself in the language of tradition and protection, even as it corrodes the very communities it claims to defend. At various points in his journey, Palermo embodied each side of that contradiction. The local boy who leveraged cultural familiarity into influence, the capo who dressed coercion in the rhetoric of helping and taking care of our own, and the witness who finally exposed the cost of that arrangement. As this story draws to a close, it is worth returning in imagination to the physical spaces that anchored its opening scenes. The industrial fringe of Staten Island, where federal agents once sat in a van, listening through headphones to conversations inside Wiggles, has changed with time. Businesses have turned over, zoning rules have shifted, the city's outer boroughs have been pulled into new patterns of development. The New Jersey social clubs where senior De Cavalcante members watched The Sopranos and critiqued its realism are, in many cases, shuttered or transformed into other uses. The modest suburban homes where captains like Palermo once hosted family gatherings while discussing collections and contracts on the side now house different families with different worries. In each of these places, the tension that defined his era, the tension between surface normalcy and hidden power, has eased. That is due in no small part to the work of those who pursued his organization, and paradoxically, to his own eventual decision to help them. The era when a relatively small group of men could, through a web of fear and favor, shape the economic rhythms of whole neighborhoods has not vanished entirely, but it has been pushed back, constrained by law and by a culture that now views such arrangements with far more suspicion than awe. Vincent "Vinny" Ocean, Palermo's life does not offer a neat moral. It offers, instead, a dense, sometimes uncomfortable record of how individuals navigate the intersection of opportunity and constraint, community and exploitation, loyalty and self-preservation. He rose, in part, because the systems around him left gaps large enough for someone with his talents and ambitions to slip through. He fell in part because other systems, the law, investigative journalism, civic reform, caught up. In between, he made choices that brought him power, wealth, fear, and, finally, a bargain that allowed him to walk away from the ruins of the world he had helped command. The camera, if we imagine it, might end not on his face, now that of an elderly man somewhere in America, but on those places he once inhabited, the streets of Brooklyn, the Union Halls of New Jersey, the outside of a now quiet club on Staten Island, the anonymous strip mall landscapes of Houston at dusk. In each, people are going about their lives, unlocking shops in the morning, hurrying children to school, commuting on buses and ferries, turning keys in office doors. Their concerns are immediate and ordinary. Most will never know how closely their routines mirror, in some broad sense, those of the communities that came before them, communities in which men like Palermo once held sway. The story of Vincent Palermo is, ultimately, a story about how close the worlds of the ordinary and the illicit can sit, separated at times by nothing more than a wall, a ledger, a handshake. It is a reminder that the health of a society is measured not only by how it treats its most notorious offenders, but by how it strengthens the institutions and norms that make such careers harder to build in the first place. In tracing his arc from Brooklyn boyhood to secretive old age, from boss to cooperator to aging businessman under another name, we see both the fragility and the resilience of those institutions. and we are left to consider what it will take, in the generations to come, to keep that fragile balance from tipping again.